In this lesson, I want to look at some things that we could do to clean up these assertions a bit and make them a little bit more expressive and easy to read. So before we do that, I need to talk about an interesting feature that a lot of Laravel's classes provide called macros. So this response object here, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just dump what this response object is and run this test again. So if we dump this response and you scroll all the way up to the top, you'll see that this isn't actually an instance of a Laravel HTTP response. It's an instance of a Laravel testing test response. So this is sort of a decorator that bundles up the actual HTTP response and provides us a lot of these nice testing helpers like response assert status, for example. Let's go ahead and look at this test response class. So one thing you'll notice about this class is that it's using this macroable trait. And what the macroable trait allows you to do is basically add new methods to the test response class at runtime from userland. So this can be really helpful when you want to add your own like custom assertions or custom helpers and stuff like that to the test response class that maybe wouldn't be useful for everyone who uses the framework, but are useful for your particular application. I'll show you an example of a macro that we could create that would be useful for us. Here we're doing kind of this thing a lot, and it's kind of ugly. We take the response, we get the original response, then we get the data from that original response, and then we get a specific key from that data. It'd be really cool if we could do something like this instead. What if we could do something just like response data as a method, and then say this is the key that we want to get from the response's data. This would save a ton of characters in this test that aren't super useful and would make it a little bit more expressive and a little bit easier to see what we're actually trying to do in this line. Let's get rid of this DD, but we'll keep both versions of this assertion here so we can make sure that things are still actually working. And I'll show you how we could go about adding this as a macro to the response. So since we're only going to use this macro in this one test for now, the way that I would go about adding it is to add it in the setup function of this test. So we'll create a setup function here. And the first thing that we'll do, as always, is call the parent setup, since that's really important and we can't forget to do that. And then we'll go ahead and add this macro. So this is what it looks like. We take the test response class, we make sure we import that, and then we call the static macro method and then pass the name of the method that we want to create. In this case, we want to create a method called data. Now we bind a closure to this method and specify the arguments that it should take. So we could do something like a function that takes a key, because that's what we're trying to get from the response. And then all we have to do here is go ahead and copy basically this implementation, paste it up here, and change a couple things to generalize it. So instead of response original get data, this is actually going to be this now. This can be confusing if you're not super familiar with how closures and binding closures works in PHP. Most of the time when you write a closure and you use this keyword, it's referencing the class that you're currently in. But it's possible to rebind this closure to any other object too. So this macro method is actually taking the closure that you pass in and rebinding it to the actual response instance. So when you say this, you're actually referring to the response. So this will let us get the original response, get the data from that response, and instead of concerts here, I think we just want to access key. And we want that to be a $sign, not a percentage sign. And then, of course, we want to return this. So let's go ahead and run this test and see if we've busted anything or if that's still working. And it does look like it's working, so we're getting 6 assertions now. So let's delete this line since we're duplicating that assertion here. And then fix these ones as well. So I'm just going to copy this section here. And then I'm going to replace all 3 of these like this. And run our tests again and see what we get. And our tests are passing, so that's awesome. Now, to make sure that things are really working the way that we want, we should also make sure that we still see the test fail when we expect it to fail. So I'm going to head over here, and I'm going to duplicate this, and instead just go back to our old concert all implementation, and just run this again and make sure that it does fail. And it does fail, so we know that things are still working the way that we want them to work. Now, this is already a big improvement over what we had before, but if you wanted to take it one step further, there's something else we could do that I think is kind of interesting too. So something that kind of bothers me a lot of the time is having to do these sorts of assertions like assert true, assert false, when really the thing we're trying to assert is slightly more complex, right? We want to make sure that this collection contains concert A. But because of the way things work, the best option we have is to assert true or assert false. We can't do anything kind of nice like assert contains or assert status, something more descriptive. And one of the biggest downfalls of this, in my opinion, is that say we reversed this to make it assert true instead of assert false. When this fails, with an assert true and assert false, you don't by default get a super descriptive error. Failed asserting that false is true. That's not super useful on its own. Now you could go ahead and add like a custom error message here if you wanted to, but that can kind of become cumbersome and a lot of work to do. And it's my experience that when you're working on a team with other people, or even when you're working on a project by yourself, it's hard to get in the habit of making sure to do this all the time. And you've probably even seen in this course, we've done that a handful of times, but for the most part, we're not providing custom messages. It'd be nice if the message that we got back by default was just slightly better on its own. So how could we go about improving that? Well, besides the response class being macroable, this class right here where the contains method is, which is Laravel's collection class, is also macroable. So we can add custom methods to the collection. Now, just like the response that contains its own assertion methods, if we wanted to, we could add custom assertions directly onto the collection. So imagine we could write code that looked something like this. Instead of asserting true that the response data concerts contains concert A, we could do something like response data concerts, and then we could say assert contains concert A. So this will let us, from the collection itself, explicitly assert that it contains a certain item, and then we could bake a better default error message into this custom assertion. So before we do that, let's go ahead and dump this out just so we can see what class it is, because it's somewhat important in this case. So if we scroll all the way to the top, you can see what we have is a database eloquent collection. So there's two collections in Laravel. There's the basic collection, which is the Illuminate support collection, and then there's the eloquent collection, which is a collection that extends that collection and provides some eloquent specific functionality. In this case, this is the collection that we want to macro. So let's head up to the top of our file again, and we'll add this in our setup as well. So let's say collection, and we'll import that, but this time we'll make sure we get that eloquent collection, and we'll macro in an assert contains method. And this is going to take a value that we're checking to see if it exists in the collection. Now, normally we would be able to do something like this, assert true, inside of this macro, right? But for the same reasons I mentioned up here, in this case, this is actually going to get bound to the collection instance. So we need some way to reference PHP unit's assertions without having access to this test case. And that's actually pretty easy to do because all of PHP unit's assertions are just static methods on the PHP unit assert class. If you look at PHP unit assert, and then look at assert true, here's the static assert true function that again just exists on this PHP unit assert class. So if we head back here, if I'm not mistaken, we can do something like assert and pull this in, PHP unit framework assert, and then we could say assert true, this contains value. So let's go ahead and try and swap over one of those. So let's just get rid of this DD call here and run this test again. And we get 6 passing assertions, so everything's still working. But now we can go ahead and add that nicer default custom error message. So say we wanted to do something like assert contains concert C, and it's not supposed to contain concert C, right? So if we run this right now, we should see a failure. But we're just back to that same failed asserting that false is true. Now that this custom assertion sort of has its own home, we can provide a better default custom message here. So we could do something like failed asserting that the collection contained the specified value. All right? It's not super great. It doesn't tell us what the value is or what the collection was, but at least when we run the test now, we can see it failed asserting that the collection contained the specified value. So it's a little bit more helpful than failed asserting that false is true. So we could turn this back to concert A now, and maybe duplicate this for concerts A, B, and D, and run this to make sure that everything is still passing, and it is. And then for this one, instead of doing assert false contains, we can make something like assert not contains. So let's add another macro up here. So we'll say collection, macro, assert not contains, and this will just be asserting false, that it contains that value. So here we'll say failed asserting that the collection did not contain the specified value. So now if we go back down here, we can duplicate this and change it to assert not contains concert C. And now all 8 of these should pass. And they do, actually 9 because we have the status code in there as well. And now we can safely remove these options and go ahead and run this test again. And we're all green, and we have these really nice to read expressive assertions. So we have response, assert status 200, response data concerts, assert contains concert A, B, and D, and also asserting that the concerts variable in the view does not contain concert C. So this is just a useful trick that you can use to modify some of these classes at runtime in your test suite and add some useful assertions to them to help make your tests a little bit nicer to read. It's also useful to use this trick of making assertions against the view data itself instead of against the template when you don't want to be coupled to the specific way that some information is presented. And this is actually the way that I usually test stuff related to the view. I'm not too concerned about how it's presented in the view, but I do care that the response is working and that the page isn't triggering some sort of error, and I care that I've passed the data to the view that I want to pass to the view, so that when someone's working in the template and doing whatever they need to present any of that data, they're always presenting the correct data, and I'm not accidentally leaking data that belongs to another user that someone else shouldn't be able to see. So this is my preferred way of testing stuff related to the view, and this macro stuff is just a nice way to make it a little bit more expressive.